It was an unusually quiet night for Sergeant Ricardo. His patrol car glided through the dimly lit streets of the city, the hum of the engine the only sound breaking the silence. The weight of years spent on the force showed in his tired eyes, but his posture remained upright, disciplined. As he turned a corner near the old municipal plaza, something caught his eye. A small figure, huddled on the cold stone steps, barely illuminated by the flickering streetlight. He slowed down, the car coming to a stop a few feet away. Through the windshield, Ricardo squinted, realizing it was a child, alone. His heart sank. Not again, he thought. Kids like her didn't usually wander the streets at this hour without a reason, a bad reason. Stepping out of the car, Ricardo adjusted his belt and approached cautiously, his boots crunching on the gravel. "Hey," he called gently, not wanting to startle her, "are you all right?" No response. The girl, no older than 8 or 9, kept her head down, knees drawn up to her chest. "Where are your parents?" he asked, crouching down to her level. His voice softened, the way he used to speak to his niece when she'd scraped her knee or lost a toy. But this girl was different. She didn't flinch, didn't cry. She just sat there, staring at the pavement as if the world around her didn't exist. He noticed her clothes, torn, dirty, like she'd been running or hiding for hours. Her shoes were mismatched, one barely hanging on to her foot. Something was very wrong. "What's your name, sweetheart?" Ricardo pressed, hoping to get anything out of her. Finally, she lifted her head just slightly, enough for him to see her face. Pale, wide-eyed, and terrified. But still, no tears. She stared at him, her lips trembling as though the weight of the world rested on them. "Lucia," she whispered, her voice hoarse, as if it had been days since she last spoke. Ricardo nodded, encouraged by the small breakthrough. "All right, Lucia. Let's get you somewhere safe, okay? You don't have to be out here alone." She didn't move, didn't acknowledge his words. He was about to try again when she suddenly spoke, her voice barely audible. "Circulo vermelho." The words sent a chill down Ricardo's spine. He froze, his mind racing. Circulo vermelho. The name rang alarms in his head, whispers among the force about an underground terrorist group, planning something big, something violent. But the rumors were always vague, always just out of reach. Until now. He looked at her, his mind in overdrive. Why would this child know about that? Who was she? And how did she get mixed up with something so dangerous? Ricardo's hand instinctively went to his radio. "Dispatch, this is Sergeant Alves," he said, keeping his voice steady despite the rising tension. "I've got a situation near the municipal plaza. I'm bringing in a child, possible connection to something bigger." The girl finally moved. She stood slowly, her small hand slipping into his, seeking comfort. Her grip was weak but desperate, like she knew he was her only lifeline. At the station, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Ricardo led Lucia through the doors. The desk sergeant raised an eyebrow, glancing between the disheveled girl and Ricardo. "What's this about?" Ricardo leaned in, keeping his voice low. "She mentioned the Circulo vermelho." The sergeant's expression immediately darkened. He knew exactly what that meant. "Get her in an interrogation room," he muttered. "I'll call the captain." Ricardo nodded, but as he looked at the girl, sitting so small and silent in the waiting area, he felt a pang of guilt. She didn't belong in a cold interrogation room. She needed help. "Let me talk to her first," Ricardo said. "She's terrified. If we push too hard, we'll lose her." The sergeant hesitated, then nodded. "All right. But make it quick. If she's involved with them, we don't have much time." In the small, sterile room, Ricardo sat across from Lucia, a cup of water in front of her that she hadn't touched. He leaned forward, elbows on the table, trying to appear as non-threatening as possible. "You're safe here, Lucia," he said gently. No one's going to hurt you. But I need you to tell me more about what you said earlier. About the circulo vermelho. Do you know what that is? She stared at the water, her fingers twitching in her lap. For a moment, Ricardo thought she wouldn't answer. Then, in a voice so soft he almost didn't hear it, she said, Tia Teresa. Ricardo frowned. Who's Teresa? Is she your aunt? Lucia shook her head. Not really. She took care of me, after my parents. Her voice cracked, and Ricardo's heart broke a little. Whatever this girl had been through, it was more than any child should ever experience. What happened to your parents? He asked, keeping his voice low, careful not to push too hard. They were with them, Lucia whispered, her eyes filling with a distant fear. With the circulo. But then they left. They told me to stay with Tia Teresa. They said it was safer. Ricardo leaned back, his mind racing. This was bigger than he thought. If her parents were involved with the circulo, and they had gone into hiding, that meant something bad was coming. Something huge. Do you know where Teresa is now? He asked. Lucia shook her head. She had friends. They came to the house. They talked about things. Scary things. I didn't understand. She paused, then added, but I heard them say it was going to happen soon. Ricardo's blood ran cold. What's going to happen soon? She didn't answer, just looked at him with wide, terrified eyes, and whispered, They're coming. The weight of her words hung in the air long after she'd spoken them. Ricardo stood in the hallway outside the interrogation room, his hands gripping the edge of the table, knuckles white. He needed to act fast. Captain Montero walked over, his expression grim. The SWAT team is on standby, he said, his voice low. If this girl is telling the truth, we're looking at a major threat. Ricardo nodded. We need to find Teresa. She's the key to all of this. And the girl? Montero asked, glancing through the small window into the room where Lucia sat, her knees drawn up to her chest again. Ricardo looked back at her, his chest tightening. We keep her safe. No matter what. Montero clapped him on the shoulder. I'll get intel working on it. But Ricardo, this could get ugly. Fast. I know, Ricardo said, his mind already turning over the possibilities. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. As he walked back into the room, Lucia looked up at him, her small face pale and tired. Are they going to find me? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ricardo crouched down next to her, meeting her eyes. Not if I can help it, he said firmly. I won't let them. But even as he spoke the words, a dark part of his mind wondered if it was already too late. Outside, the city continued its quiet hum, unaware of the storm brewing just beneath the surface. Ricardo watched the sun begin to rise over the buildings, the first light of dawn casting long shadows across the street. Whatever the Circulo Vermelho had planned, it was coming, and they had precious little time to stop it. Lucia's soft voice echoed in his mind, a warning that he couldn't shake. They're coming. The fluorescent lights of the station buzzed faintly, casting a sterile glow over the room where Lucia sat, small and silent. Ricardo stood just outside the door, speaking in hushed tones with Captain Montero. She hasn't said anything else? Montero asked, arms crossed, his eyes fixed on the door. Not a word, Ricardo replied, rubbing the back of his neck. But the mention of the Circulo Vermelho? That's not something a kid just picks up. She's involved somehow. Or at least, she knows something critical. Montero's jaw tightened. We can't wait too long. If what she said is real, we could be looking at a serious threat in the city. I know. But she's terrified. Pushing her too hard could shut her down completely. Ricardo glanced through the small window into the interrogation room. Lucia hadn't moved. We need someone she can trust. Someone who can get through to her. Montero nodded thoughtfully. I'll get child services on the line. Maybe an advocate can help break the ice. As Montero walked away, Ricardo lingered at the window, watching Lucia's small frame huddle deeper into her chair. There was something deeply unsettling about the way she sat there, so still, like she was waiting for something to happen, something terrible. An hour later, Ricardo sat across from Lucia once again, his tone gentle but insistent. Lucia, I know you're scared. But the more you can tell us, the safer we can keep you. We just want to help, he urged. Lucia's eyes flickered toward him, but her lips remained sealed. Ricardo leaned forward slightly, hoping his calm presence might coax her into speaking. Who is Teresa? You mentioned her before. Is she the one who took care of you? Ricardo asked, careful not to sound too aggressive. Lucia's small fingers fidgeted with the hem of her shirt, and finally, she nodded. Yes, she took care of me, Lucia whispered, her voice barely audible. She said my parents, they couldn't anymore. Ricardo nodded, encouraging her to continue. And your parents, where are they now? For a long moment, there was silence. Then, in a voice thick with fear and sadness, Lucia answered, they're gone. They left me with her. They told me they were doing something important, something for the circulo. Ricardo's heart dropped. This wasn't just an accident. Her parents had knowingly left her with a woman involved in one of the most dangerous organizations he'd ever heard of. Do you know what the circulo is, Lucia? He asked, treading carefully. She shook her head quickly, her curls bouncing with the movement. No. I just heard them talking about it. Teresa and her friends, they were always talking about the circulo. About something big. Ricardo's stomach churned. Something big? What kind of things did they say? Lucia hesitated, biting her lip, then whispered, they said it was going to happen soon. That people would notice, that everyone would know. Outside the interrogation room, Ricardo paced back and forth, trying to wrap his head around what Lucia had revealed. Montero walked over, his expression grim. The tech guys picked up some chatter, Montero said. Encrypted messages, but they match the patterns we've seen before. Looks like the circulo is getting ready to move. Ricardo's jaw tightened. We need to find Teresa. If Lucia's right, she's one of the key players in this. Montero nodded. I've got a team tracing leads on her. If she's connected, we'll find her. Ricardo hesitated for a moment, his mind racing with possibilities. What if we don't have enough time? What if, whatever they're planning is happening sooner than we think? Montero's gaze hardened. That's why we're moving fast. The SWAT team is on standby. If we get so much as a hint of where they're staging this, we're going in. Ricardo swallowed the knot in his throat. We're putting everything on the line for this girl's intel. It better pay off. It has to, Montero said flatly. We don't have a choice. Hours later, as the night deepened, Ricardo sat in his office, staring at a file on his desk. The words blurred together as exhaustion settled into his bones. But sleep wasn't an option, not when they were racing against time. A soft knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. It was Lucia, standing in the doorway, her small figure illuminated by the dim light of the hallway. Can I come in? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Ricardo nodded, motioning for her to sit down. She moved slowly, almost cautiously, as though every step required careful thought. Are you okay? Ricardo asked gently, noticing the shadows under her eyes. Lucia didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked down at her hands, her fingers twisting nervously in her lap. I don't know what to do, she said finally. I don't know what's going to happen. We're going to keep you safe, Ricardo assured her, though his own doubts gnawed at him. That's what's going to happen. But what about them? Lucia asked, her voice trembling. What about Teresa and the others. They won't stop, will they? Ricardo hesitated. We're going to stop them, Lucia. That's why I need your help. You're the only one who can tell us where they are, what they're planning. Lucia's eyes filled with tears, and she quickly looked away, blinking them back. I'm scared, she whispered. What if they find me? What if they come back for me? Ricardo's heart ached at the fear in her voice. He wished he could give her the comfort she so desperately needed. But the truth was, there were no guarantees. We won't let them hurt you, Ricardo promised, though the weight of that promise felt heavier than ever. You have my word. Later that night, as Ricardo was finishing up his report, the door to his office creaked open again. This time, it was Captain Montero, his face tight with concern. We've got something, Montero said without preamble, handing Ricardo a file. One of the surveillance teams picked up a lead. A warehouse on the outskirts of the city. Fits the description of where the circulo has been seen before. Ricardo flipped through the file, his pulse quickening. Are we moving in? Montero nodded. The SWAT team is mobilizing as we speak. We'll hit them before dawn. Ricardo stood, grabbing his jacket. I'm coming with you. Montero hesitated for a split second, then nodded. Fine. But this is going to get messy, Ricardo. Be ready. The SWAT van rumbled down the dark, deserted streets, the tension inside thick enough to cut with a knife. Ricardo sat across from Montero, checking his gun, mentally preparing for the operation ahead. You sure about this place? Ricardo asked, his voice low. Montero nodded grimly. All signs point here. If they're hiding out, we'll find them. Ricardo's gaze drifted to the other members of the SWAT team, their faces stoic, focused. They were ready for whatever was coming. He just hoped they were ready for what they might find. As the van slowed to a stop, Montero signaled for silence. The team moved in sync, slipping out into the shadows of the alleyway that led to the warehouse. Ricardo's heart pounded in his chest, every sense on high alert as they approached the building. A faint light flickered from a broken window, the only sign of life inside the otherwise abandoned structure. Montero motioned to the team, his voice a low whisper. We go in silent. No one makes a move until we confirm targets. Ricardo nodded, gripping his gun tightly as they moved closer to the entrance. The door creaked as Montero pushed it open, the sound echoing in the empty space. Inside, the warehouse was dark, cold. The only sound was the soft shuffle of boots on concrete as the team fanned out, searching for any sign of movement. Ricardo's pulse raced as he scanned the shadows, his gun raised, ready. But the longer they searched, the clearer it became, there was no one here. Montero cursed under his breath, lowering his weapon. Damn it. They're gone. Ricardo frowned, his eyes scanning the room. They had to have been here recently. There's no way they could have just vanished. Look, one of the SWAT members called, pointing to a desk in the corner. A laptop sat open, its screen flickering with code. Montero hurried over, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the screen. It's a message, he said grimly. Encrypted. But it looks like they're moving. And fast. Ricardo's gut twisted. We need to decrypt it. Now. Montero nodded, already pulling out his phone to call the tech team. Get ready, Ricardo. Whatever this is, it's about to go down. And we've got almost no time to stop it. The SWAT van hurtled through the empty streets, the tension inside as thick as the darkness outside. Ricardo sat in silence, his eyes focused on the distant lights of the city skyline. His heart raced, pounding in rhythm with the tires on the road. He knew this operation had to go perfectly, there was no room for mistakes. Montero, seated across from him, leaned in closer. We decrypt the message yet? Ricardo nodded. It wasn't easy, but our tech guys managed to pull something out of the mess. They're targeting a large-scale event. Some kind of gathering at the convention center. Montero let out a low whistle. That place is packed tonight. Charity gala. Hundreds of civilians. Ricardo's stomach dropped. He had hoped, desperately, that whatever the Circulo Vermelho was planning, it wouldn't be so public, so devastating. But now, with this new intel, the gravity of the situation hit him hard. We've got less than 2 hours to get in, find them, and stop this. 2 hours might be too generous, Montero muttered, checking his watch. We go in hard and fast. No hesitation. Understood. Ricardo nodded, tightening his grip on his rifle. His thoughts drifted to Lucia, the little girl who had unknowingly sparked this entire mission. Every piece of information she gave had led them here, to this moment, where the lives of so many hung in the balance. He couldn't afford to think about failure. The van screeched to a halt, and the team quickly disembarked. The massive glass structure of the convention center loomed before them, the bright lights inside illuminating the dozens of well-dressed attendees, completely unaware of the danger about to unfold. Positions, Montero barked, motioning the team to split up. Ricardo, you're with me. We'll enter from the east side. Ricardo followed Montero through a narrow alleyway, the two of them moving swiftly but silently. They reached a side door, and Montero expertly picked the lock. The door swung open with a soft creak, and they slipped inside. The interior of the convention center was a stark contrast to the tense atmosphere outside. Crystal chandeliers glimmered above, and the soft hum of polite conversation filled the air. Waiters in black and white uniforms weaved between tables, serving drinks to the city's elite. No one suspected that a deadly plot was in motion. We don't have much time, Ricardo whispered, scanning the room for any sign of Teresa or her associates. Intel says there's a restricted area in the back, near the main stage, Montero replied. We hit that first. They moved through the crowd, careful not to draw attention. Ricardo's pulse quickened as they neared the stage, where a velvet curtain concealed a small door marked, Authorized Personnel Only. Montero glanced at him, then nodded. Ricardo quietly pushed the door open. The hallway behind the stage was dimly lit, the only sound the distant murmur of the gala. They crept forward, their weapons drawn, every sense heightened. Ricardo's heart pounded in his chest as they approached a door at the end of the hall. This had to be it. Teresa and her people had to be here. Montero signaled for silence, and Ricardo took position on one side of the door while Montero prepared to breach. In one swift motion, Montero kicked the door open, and they rushed in, guns raised. Inside, the room was filled with computers, blueprints, and boxes of what looked like explosives. Teresa stood in the middle, her face a mask of calm as several men worked quickly around her. She didn't flinch when they entered, as if she had been expecting them. Stop! Montero shouted, his gun trained on her. Hands in the air, now. Teresa smiled, a cold, calculated smile that sent a chill down Ricardo's spine. You're too late, she said softly, her voice dripping with malice. It's already begun. Ricardo's heart stopped. What are you talking about? Teresa didn't answer. Instead, she gestured toward one of the computers. On the screen, a countdown ticked away, 59 minutes. We've planted the bombs, she said casually, as if discussing the weather. Several of them. Scattered throughout the building. When the timer hits 0, they'll detonate. You can stop me, but you can't stop the explosions. Ricardo's blood ran cold. Where are they? He demanded, stepping closer, his gun still trained on her. Teresa tilted her head, her eyes gleaming with wicked satisfaction. You'll never find them all in time. Montero took a step forward. Where are they, Teresa? Tell us, and maybe. She cut him off with a laugh, shaking her head. You don't understand, do you? This isn't about saving people. This is about sending a message. You can arrest me, kill me even, but the circulo lives on. Our cause is bigger than any one of us. Ricardo felt the weight of the situation crushing him. They were running out of time, and Teresa wasn't going to give them anything. Desperation clawed at him as he glanced at the countdown. Less than an hour to save hundreds of lives. Montero, ever composed, kept his gun steady. Then we'll make you talk. But before he could move, one of the men in the room lunged toward the computer, reaching for something. Without hesitation, Montero fired, dropping the man instantly. The room erupted into chaos. Teresa's men scrambled, drawing weapons, but the SWAT team was faster. Gunfire echoed through the small space as Ricardo and Montero took out the remaining threats. In seconds, it was over. The room fell silent, save for the ominous ticking of the countdown. Teresa, still standing, raised her hands in mock surrender. Go ahead, she said softly. You've stopped us here. But you'll never save them all. Ricardo's mind raced. He had to think. They needed to find the bombs, but they couldn't do it alone. He turned to Montero. We need to get Lucia. Montero frowned. What are you talking about? She's been with Teresa for years, Ricardo explained, his voice urgent. She might know where the bombs are, or at least give us a clue. It's the only chance we've got. Montero hesitated, glancing at Teresa, who simply smiled, as if daring them to try. All right, he said finally. We bring her in. But we're running out of time. Back at the station, Ricardo rushed into the room where Lucia sat, her small frame curled up on a chair. She looked up as he entered, her eyes wide with fear. Lucia, Ricardo said gently, crouching down beside her. I need your help. It's important. Her lower lip trembled. What's happening? Did they find Tia Teresa? Ricardo nodded, his heart heavy. We did. But she's planted bombs, Lucia. A lot of them. And we don't have much time to stop them. I need you to tell me if you know anything at all, that could help us find them. Lucia's eyes filled with tears, and she shook her head. I don't know. She never told me about bombs. Ricardo took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. Think, Lucia. Did you ever hear her talk about places? Rooms? Anything that seemed strange or secret? Lucia's brow furrowed in concentration. For a long moment, she was silent. Then, finally, she spoke. There was a room she never let me go in. It was near the kitchens, in the back of the convention center. She said it was off limits. Ricardo's pulse quickened. Do you think the bombs could be there? Lucia shrugged, her small shoulders shaking. I don't know. But maybe. It was the best lead they had. Ricardo stood, his mind racing. Thank you, Lucia. You've done great. He turned to leave, but Lucia's voice stopped him. Ricardo, be careful. Tia Teresa, she's dangerous. He nodded, giving her a reassuring smile. I will. Stay here, you're safe now. With Lucia's information, the SWAT team moved quickly, making their way through the convention center toward the kitchens. Ricardo's heart pounded in his chest as they approached the area Lucia had described. Time was running out, the countdown was nearing the final minutes. As they entered the back hallway, a faint beeping sound reached Ricardo's ears. His blood ran cold. The bombs. Montero motioned for the team to spread out, searching the area. Ricardo followed the sound, his pulse racing as it grew louder and louder. Finally, he found it, a small, inconspicuous box hidden behind a stack of crates. The timer on it read 15 minutes and 47 seconds. We've got one. Ricardo shouted, motioning for the bomb squad to move in. As they worked to disarm it, Ricardo's mind raced. They had one bomb, but how many more were there? And could they find them all before time ran out? The minutes ticked by agonizingly slow as the bomb squad worked, sweat dripping down their faces. Finally, with just seconds to spare, the bomb was disarmed. But Ricardo knew this wasn't over. Somewhere in the convention center, more bombs were waiting to go off. And time was almost up. He turned to Montero, his voice grim. We need to move. Now. The countdown weighed heavily on Ricardo's mind as the SWAT team moved quickly through the hallways of the convention center. Every second that ticked by felt like a step closer to disaster. The bomb squad had just disarmed one device, but there were more hidden somewhere in the vast building, and time was running out. Ricardo, over here. Montero's voice broke through the tense silence as he waved him over. Ricardo hurried to his side, where a group of officers were gathered around a door. It was marked with a sign that read, Service Access, leading to the lower levels of the convention center. If Teresa had hidden more bombs, it was likely down there, away from the eyes of the public. We have reason to believe more of the devices are in the lower storage areas, Montero said, his expression grim. We're splitting the team, half will stay here and secure the upper levels, while the rest of us sweep the basement. You're with me. Ricardo nodded, his heart pounding with adrenaline and anxiety. He couldn't shake the image of Lucia, her wide eyes filled with fear when she told him about the restricted area. He had to trust that she'd given him the right lead, if not, hundreds of lives could be lost tonight. Montero gave the signal, and the team moved into formation. The hallway narrowed as they descended the stairs, the air growing colder and more damp as they went deeper into the building. The distant hum of the gala faded, replaced by an eerie silence that made Ricardo's nerves stand on edge. Suddenly, the radios crackled to life. Team Alpha to base, confirming no suspicious activity in the main event area. All clear on the upper levels. Montero pressed the radio to his mouth. Copy that, Alpha. We're proceeding with the sweep below. As they reached the basement level, the group split into two smaller teams. Ricardo and Montero led their squad down a dark, narrow corridor lined with storage rooms. The musty smell of old furniture and cleaning supplies hung in the air, the dim fluorescent lights flickering overhead. Keep your eyes open, Montero whispered as they approached the first door. He motioned to Ricardo. You're up. Ricardo nodded and stepped forward, his hand gripping the cold metal of the doorknob. He opened it slowly, the hinges creaking as the door revealed a cluttered storage room filled with crates and boxes. Ricardo scanned the room, his flashlight casting long shadows against the walls. Clear, he said, stepping back out into the hallway. They moved methodically, clearing each room one by one, but there was no sign of the bombs. The tension grew with each empty room they found, the ticking clock in Ricardo's head growing louder with every step. I don't like this, Montero muttered under his breath. It's too quiet. Ricardo felt the same unease. Something was off. Teresa had been too confident, too sure that they wouldn't find all the bombs in time. There had to be more. They were missing something. As they approached the last door at the end of the hallway, Ricardo's heart raced. This was their final chance. If they didn't find anything here, they were out of leads, and time was almost up. Montero gestured for silence as they approached the door. This one looked different from the others, heavier, reinforced. Ricardo exchanged a glance with Montero, who gave a nod. Together, they pushed the door open. The room inside was dark, but as their flashlights swept across the space, they saw it, a large metal crate, sitting in the center of the room, cables running from it to the walls. Ricardo's pulse quickened as he realized what it was. Bomb squad, get in here now. Montero barked into his radio. The bomb techs rushed into the room, immediately setting to work on the device. Ricardo stood back, his eyes locked on the countdown timer displayed on the bomb. Less than 15 minutes. They were cutting it close, too close. One of the bomb techs, a young man named Grant, knelt down in front of the device, his hands steady but his face pale. "It's wired to the main power grid," he said, his voice tight with tension. "If we cut the wrong wire, the whole thing could blow. We need to be careful." Montero glanced at Ricardo, his expression grim. "We're running out of time. We need to find the others." Ricardo's mind raced. "There might be more down here. We have to keep searching." Montero nodded. "Go. I'll stay here with the bomb squad." Ricardo didn't hesitate. He turned and sprinted down the hallway, his boots echoing against the concrete floor. His thoughts were a blur, racing between Lucia's warnings, Teresa's cold smile, and the ticking clock. They couldn't afford any more delays. Ricardo burst through another door at the end of the hallway, his flashlight sweeping the room. This one was larger, filled with rows of industrial shelves stacked with supplies. And there, tucked behind a stack of crates, was another device, identical to the one the bomb squad was working on. "Montero, we've got another one," Ricardo called into his radio, his breath coming fast. "Copy that," Montero's voice crackled back. "Sit tight, we're sending a second team your way." Ricardo's heart raced as he crouched down near the bomb, his flashlight illuminating the timer. 12 minutes. The pressure was suffocating. He could hear footsteps approaching as the second bomb squad team arrived, their faces set in grim determination. "Can you disarm it?" Ricardo asked, his voice tight. One of the techs nodded, his hands already at work. "We've got a chance. Just keep watch." Ricardo stood, his back to the door as the team worked. Every sound, every creak of the old building made his pulse spike. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Teresa had been too calm, too assured that her plan would succeed. What if this was just a distraction? The thought gnawed at him as the seconds ticked by. And then, a voice crackled through his radio, Montero's voice, laced with urgency. "Ricardo, we've got movement in the upper levels. Looks like Teresa's people are still in the building. Be prepared for hostiles." Ricardo's grip tightened on his gun. Of course. Teresa had never planned to just let them disarm the bombs. Her people were still here, waiting to strike when the moment was right. "Copy that," Ricardo replied, his voice low. He glanced at the bomb squad, who were still working frantically. "You need to hurry." The techs didn't respond, their focus entirely on the device in front of them. Ricardo moved toward the door, peering out into the hallway. It was quiet, too quiet. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end as he scanned the shadows. And then, he heard it, a faint sound, like footsteps. Ricardo's heart pounded in his chest as he raised his weapon, every muscle tensed. The door at the end of the hallway swung open, and a figure stepped through, dressed in dark clothes, a gun in hand. Ricardo didn't hesitate. He fired once, twice, and the figure crumpled to the ground. But there were more. Shadows moved in the hallway, and gunfire erupted as Teresa's people launched their attack. Ricardo ducked behind the doorframe, returning fire as the bullets ricocheted off the walls. "Montero, we've got hostiles down here." Ricardo shouted into his radio, his voice barely audible over the gunfire. "Hold your position, we're sending reinforcements," Montero replied. Ricardo gritted his teeth, firing another round as one of the attackers tried to rush the door. The bomb squad was still working behind him, their hands steady despite the chaos unfolding around them. Almost there, one of the techs muttered, sweat dripping down his forehead. Just a few more seconds. But Ricardo wasn't sure they had a few more seconds. The attackers were closing in, their gunfire growing more intense. He could hear footsteps pounding down the hallway, reinforcements, but whether they were friend or foe, he couldn't tell. Suddenly, one of the bomb techs shouted. "Got it." Ricardo glanced back just in time to see the timer on the bomb flicker off. Relief flooded through him, but there was no time to celebrate. More attackers were pouring into the hallway, and the firefight was far from over. Montero's team arrived moments later, their presence turning the tide of the battle. The attackers were quickly overwhelmed, their bodies falling to the ground as the SWAT team pressed forward. Ricardo stood in the aftermath, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he surveyed the scene. The bomb was disarmed. The attackers were neutralized. But there was no sign of Teresa. "Where is she?" Ricardo muttered, frustration gnawing at him. She had to be here. She wouldn't just leave without seeing her plan through. Montero approached, his face grim. "We've secured the area. But there's no sign of Teresa." Ricardo clenched his fists. They had stopped the bombs, but Teresa was still out there, waiting for her next move. "We're not done yet," Ricardo said, his voice hard. "She's still out there, and she won't stop until she's finished what she started." Montero nodded, his jaw tight. "Then we find her. No matter what." Ricardo's mind raced. The bombs had been disarmed, but the fight wasn't over. Teresa was still out there, and the clock was still ticking. As the team regrouped and prepared for the final push, Ricardo couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. The night outside the convention center was eerily quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos and tension brewing inside. Ricardo stood at the edge of the crowd, his eyes scanning the sea of people, every sense on high alert. He had come this far, but Teresa was still out there. Somewhere in the crowd, lurking, waiting for the right moment to strike. "We've secured most of the area," Montero's voice crackled through Ricardo's earpiece. "Bomb squads have cleared the lower levels, but we still haven't located Teresa. We can't relax until we have her in custody." Ricardo nodded, eyes still fixed on the moving figures in front of him. "She's here, I know it. She's not going to leave without finishing what she started." He glanced at the nearby stage, where a speaker was addressing the crowd. The attendees, oblivious to the danger, clapped politely, unaware that their lives hung by a thread. Ricardo's heart pounded with the weight of responsibility. Every second counted. Every moment that passed without finding Teresa brought them closer to catastrophe. Suddenly, his radio buzzed again. It was Lucia. "Ricardo, I saw her." Ricardo's breath caught. "Where? Where did you see her, Lucia?" "She's near the stage," Lucia whispered, her voice trembling. "But she's dressed differently. I almost didn't recognize her." Ricardo's heart raced. "Stay where you are, Lucia. Don't move. We'll handle it." He sprinted toward the stage, pushing through the crowd, his hand on his weapon. Montero's team followed closely behind, their faces set in grim determination. Ricardo's mind raced, piecing together every fragment of information they had about Teresa's plan. The bombs had been disarmed, but that didn't mean she had given up. If anything, it meant she was desperate, dangerous. As they neared the stage, Ricardo scanned the faces in the crowd, searching for any sign of Teresa. And then, he saw her. She was standing near the back, blending in with the crowd, her blonde hair now hidden beneath a dark scarf. But her eyes, those cold, calculating eyes, gave her away. "Teresa," Ricardo muttered under his breath. He motioned to Montero, who nodded, signaling his team to fan out. Ricardo moved forward, his gaze locked on Teresa as he pushed through the crowd. She hadn't noticed him yet. She was too focused on the stage, her eyes fixed on the speaker, waiting for her moment to strike. Just as Ricardo was about to close the distance, Teresa's gaze shifted. Her eyes met his, and for a brief second, time seemed to freeze. Her expression flickered, surprise, then anger, then cold calculation. She turned, disappearing into the crowd. "Move!" Ricardo shouted, breaking into a run. Montero and the SWAT team followed, their footsteps pounding against the pavement as they chased Teresa through the maze of people. Ricardo's heart hammered in his chest as he pushed through the crowd, his eyes locked on Teresa's figure as she darted toward the exit. She was fast, but Ricardo was faster. He surged forward, closing the gap between them. "Teresa! Stop!" Ricardo shouted, his voice cutting through the noise of the crowd. Teresa glanced over her shoulder, her face twisted in a mixture of fear and fury. She reached into her jacket, and Ricardo's blood ran cold. She was going for a weapon. Without thinking, Ricardo lunged, tackling Teresa to the ground just as she pulled a small pistol from her jacket. The gun clattered to the ground as they hit the pavement, and the crowd around them screamed, scattering in all directions. "Get off me!" Teresa hissed, struggling beneath Ricardo's weight. Ricardo pinned her arms to the ground, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "It's over, Teresa." She glared up at him, her eyes filled with hatred. "You think you've won? You think this changes anything?" "You failed," Ricardo said, his voice hard. "The bombs are disarmed. Your plan is finished." Teresa let out a harsh laugh. "You think I care about the bombs? That was never the real goal." Ricardo frowned, his grip on her tightening. "What are you talking about?" "The bombs were just a distraction," Teresa spat. "The real plan was never about destruction. It was about sending a message. And I've already done that." Ricardo's stomach dropped. "What message?" Teresa smiled, a cold, twisted smile. "The Circulo Vermelho doesn't die. You may have stopped me, but there are others. And they're watching." Before Ricardo could respond, Montero and the SWAT team arrived, pulling Teresa to her feet and placing her in handcuffs. She didn't resist, her smile never wavering. As they led her away, Ricardo stood in silence, his mind racing. The bombs had been disarmed. Teresa had been captured. But her words echoed in his head. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Back at the station, Ricardo sat in the interrogation room, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. Across the table, Teresa sat calmly, her expression unreadable. Montero stood by the door, arms crossed, watching the exchange. "We know you weren't working alone," Ricardo said, his voice steady. "Give us names. Tell us who else is involved." Teresa tilted her head, her eyes gleaming with amusement. "You really think I'm going to tell you anything? I've said everything I need to say." Ricardo leaned forward, his jaw tight. "You don't have to protect them. This is your chance to end it." Teresa's smile faded, her expression hardening. "You still don't get it, do you? This isn't about me. It's bigger than any of us. You can arrest me, kill me even, but the Circulo will live on. And you'll never stop it." Ricardo's chest tightened with frustration. He could see that she believed every word she said. She wasn't just a criminal, she was a fanatic, willing to die for her cause. "We'll find them," Ricardo said, his voice low. "We'll stop them." Teresa shrugged. "Maybe you will. But for every one you stop, another will rise. You can't stop an idea." Montero stepped forward, his patience clearly wearing thin. "This is over, Teresa. We have you. You've lost." Teresa met his gaze, her expression cold. "You'll see. Sooner or later, you'll see." With that, she leaned back in her chair, her smile returning. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I'd like to speak to my lawyer." Montero exchanged a glance with Ricardo, then nodded. "Get her out of here," he muttered to the officers waiting outside. As they escorted Teresa from the room, Ricardo let out a long breath, the weight of the night settling heavily on his shoulders. It was over, for now. But Teresa's words lingered, a dark shadow over what should have been a victory. Later that evening, Ricardo sat in his office, staring out the window at the city below. The lights of the buildings twinkled in the distance, the streets quiet after the chaos of the night. But the peace felt fragile, temporary. He couldn't shake the feeling that Teresa had been right, that this was just the beginning. A soft knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. He turned to see Lucia standing in the doorway, her small frame silhouetted against the light from the hallway. "Can I come in?" she asked quietly. Ricardo smiled, motioning for her to sit down. "Of course." Lucia walked over to the chair across from him, sitting down with a small sigh. Is it really over?" Ricardo hesitated, searching for the right words. "For now," he said gently. "But there's still work to be done." Lucia nodded slowly, her eyes filled with a sadness that seemed too heavy for someone her age. "I was so scared," she whispered. I thought Tia Teresa would hurt you." Ricardo's chest tightened at the fear in her voice. "You don't have to worry about her anymore, Lucia. She can't hurt anyone now." Lucia looked down at her hands, her fingers twisting nervously. "But what if there are others? What if they come for me?" Ricardo leaned forward, his voice soft but firm. "I won't let that happen. You're safe now, Lucia. I promise." For the first time that night, Lucia smiled, a small, tentative smile, but a smile nonetheless. "Thank you, Ricardo. For everything." Ricardo felt a warmth spread through his chest, the weight of the night lifting just a little. "You're welcome, Lucia. And I'll be here. Whenever you need me." Lucia stood, giving him one last smile before quietly leaving the office. Ricardo watched her go, his heart filled with a mixture of relief and lingering uncertainty. The night was quiet again, but in the back of Ricardo's mind, Teresa's words echoed like a distant storm. The fight wasn't over. Not yet. But for now, there was peace. And that was enough.